Hello, I'm Mark Payne of the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Live. History Live is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. These presentations are both entertaining and educational. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to nonprofit organizations across West Virginia, such as schools, libraries, historical societies, and a wide range of community groups. Their presentation fee is paid by the Council, and we ask only that travel costs be covered by the host group. History Live is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. We encourage your organization or school to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Live presenters have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Live presentation is not a play. It is an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to the offerings at your school or organization. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Live character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio General Thomas Stonewall Jackson.
Good citizens of the sovereign state of Virginia and honored guests, I have been directed by General Lee to present myself this day, the 16th day of February, 1863. The purpose of General Lee having me meet with you this day is to expound upon our recent incursion of the North, in particular the Battle of Sharpsburg. General Lee has been receiving many requests for a meeting such as this to explain the importance of this strategic mission. I was reluctant to accept this assignment as I am a poor public speaker, but the pressing duties that General Lee has as commanding officer has drawn him away, and he has sent me in his stead. Again, I was reluctant, but General Lee informed me that it was my duty, and with the blessings of a kind and merciful Father, I have always performed my duty. The Confederate Army and that of Virginia was simply formed to repulse the invasion of a foreign force. With Mr. Lincoln's support of an abusive tax upon the South, his ignoring the rights of sovereign states to secede, and with his unconstitutional acts of blockades of southern ports, and the raising of a national army for the invasion of the South, Virginia had no other choice but to secede and engage in a struggle in a fight for our second independence. We've been at this war now for over 2 years. And even though the North has had poor military leadership thus far, it has tremendous advantages in industrial resources and personnel. This is not a war that the South can long sustain. And for this reason, it was decided that we must make an incursion north. We took on the strategic venture for the following reasons. 1, we had had recent successes under General Lee's command, such as the Valley Campaign, the repulsing of General McClellan's invasion of the peninsula and threat to Richmond, and the defeat of Pope's army at the Second Battle of Manassas. It was felt that this time was right, that if we would go north and have one more strategical victory, that the countries of Britain and France were on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy. and we desperately needed the resources that they could provide us. 2, we hoped to undermine the radical Republicans of the North and thereby strengthen the Peace Democrats in their move towards midterm elections of November '62. We was hoping to shatter Mr. Lincoln's war coalition and force him to sue for peace. Our third aim was to liberate Maryland, who Mr. Lincoln had put under martial law. He had unconstitutionally suppressed and done away with habeas corpus, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. In fact, he had gone so far as to arrest Maryland legislature to prevent them from meeting and discussing the issues of secession. Our fourth reason was to resupply our army with goods that we might be able to capture from Union forces and to purchase from the Maryland and Pennsylvania farmers and merchants. Our last reason was to afford our own farmers in Northern Virginia to harvest their crops without the ravages of war or being harassed by a foreign force. To do this, General Lee determined that we should invade the North, and our objective was Harrisonburg, Pennsylvania, a Union supply base and a railroad junction. But before we could accomplish this, we must eliminate the Union concentrations at Harper's Ferry. We needed to do this to protect our lines of communication, our lines of supply, and afford us a safe avenue to return. This assignment fell to me. On the 15th of September, 1862, with the gallant assistance of Generals A.P. Hill, McLaws, Walker, and with the blessings of a kind Heavenly Father, we were given a great victory. We accepted the surrender of the largest army ever to surrender on American soil, along with all of its supplies. But we were greatly puzzled by the celerity with which General McClellan was in pursuit of us. With the fall of Harper's Ferry and my arrival at Sharpsburg, I concurred with General Lee that he was occupying good, high, defensible ground, especially with the banks of the Antietam being so steep. But again, we were in a quandary about why General McClellan's character had changed and he was acting so boldly. We have since learned through Southern informers that General Lee's General Order 191 had been inadvertently lost and fell into his possession. Had this unfortunate event not occurred, I assure you that our incursion in the North would even been more successful. Arrayed for this battle, the Union had under their control 87,000 troops and 275 cannon, while on our side we were able to muster only 35,000 and had 194 cannon. As usual, Confederate forces were outnumbered 3-1 in personnel and had a great deficit in the amount of cannon available. The Battle of Sharpsburg began at dawn on September 17th. And after a horribly destructive long days of battle, the losses incurred by the Confederates were 10,000 casualties, and the Union sustained 13,000 casualties. These 23,000 casualties would account for the single bloodiest day in American history. Because General Lee realized that he was still greatly outnumbered, he decided to tactically withdraw to Virginia. He also realized that we had lost the element of surprise and that further incursion north was not advisable. We took this tactical withdrawal on the evening of the 18th so that we could go back into Virginia and reorganize and refit for further battle. Other than some light engagements on our rear guard, General McClellan proved that he was in no mood to tangle with General Lee again. So what is our evaluation of this incursion to the north? First, we were able to resupply our army by those supplies captured at Harper's Ferry and purchased from the Maryland farmers and merchants. Two, our own Virginia farmers in the north part of Virginia were very happy to bring in their crops without being harassed. Three, we certainly gave the peace Democrats of the north grounds by which to gain momentum. Four, we certainly hope that this victory would allow Britain and France to recognize us. Unfortunately, our last goal of freeing and liberating Maryland was not met. We cannot blame the Maryland people. After all, they had been suffering for 2 years under martial law, and they were reluctant to rise up, seeing as how we could afford them little protection as they organized, and especially once the Union forces became aware of our presence. While we did not take this incursion as far north as we intended to, we did capture the largest army in American history, 13,000 men with all of its supplies and military stores. When you combine this with the 13,000 casualties that the Union suffered at the Battle of Sharpsburg, you can see that they sustained 26,000 casualties to only 10,000. How could anybody not see as this is an outright victory for the Confederacy? What we did not see was the cunning and the audacity of Mr. Lincoln. Through the Northern press, which he controlled, they were not truthful with their citizens about the true outcome of the Battle of Sharpsburg. They greatly underestimated their casualties and greatly overestimated the size of our army. They had reported our army to be 97,000 strong. And with our tactical withdrawal for reasons we've already mentioned, he could continue to lie about the outcome of this battle. And 5 days after this battle, he issues what he calls his Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that they'd had a great victory at the Battle of what he called Antietam, and had repelled the invaders. Now, there'd been a great deal of press in the North about Mr. Lincoln being a great emancipator. I ask you, did he free any slaves in the states that he controlled? The answer is no. Did Mr. Lincoln go to war to free the slaves? Again, I tell you, the answer is no. Before the war broke out, he made many statements that he did not care about slavery one way or the other as long as the Union could be preserved. He went to war to continue an abusive tax on the South. And in fact, he had endorsed the Morrill Tariff Act. It is a fact that 75% of the federal treasury has come from a tax on manufactured goods imported by our southern farmers. And 80% of this treasury finds its way north to build roads, canals, and support northern industries. And with this Morrill Tariff Act that he had endorsed, it was going to raise this modest 18% tax to an outrageous 47%. That's the true reason that he was going to reinforce Fort Sumter, so that he can impose this foreign tax in a southern port of a state that was no longer a part of his union. So why did he issue the Emancipation Proclamation? He and his cohorts stated that it was a war measure. They were hopeful that it would cause civil insurrection and slave riots in the South, much the same that had happened in Haiti in not too distant past. He felt that these civil insurrections would require the male population that was mostly after war to come back and put down these civil insurrections. This has not happened. I'll tell you why it has not happened. In most places in the South, slaves were treated much better than the white immigrants have been treated in the industrial industrial sweatshops up north. Now, don't get me wrong. I did not go to war to defend slavery. General Lee and I both wish for its demise, and so do a majority of those gallant men who have fought so bravely. We do argue that each sovereign state has a right to bring about slavery of its own accord and in its own manner, just as the northern states had done. Doing so while protecting our economy and allowing time to transition the slaves into a paid workforce. Mr. Lincoln also issued his Emancipation Proclamation for the purposes of strengthening his war coalition by adding the Northern Abolitionist movement, thereby overwhelming the peace Democrats that were wanting to sue for peace. But I'm afraid that his third reason is the worst of them all. He has now made this war about slavery to disguise the real issues that brought about this war. And the worst of it, I'm afraid, that Britain and France will now not recognize the Confederacy because of this proclamation. I hope that I have enlightened you on the reasons for this incursion to the North and the true facts of its outcome. I pray to a kind Heavenly Father that He will once again bring us peace and put an end to this war. I pray so hard that He will give us once again the chance to be a free, governing people. But most of all, I pray that His will be done.
We're back with General Stonewall Jackson. General, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule for you and being with us today. I'd like to first ask you if you could tell us a little bit about your childhood and your years growing up.
I was born in Clarksburg, Virginia, on January 21st, 1824. 2 years later, I had to lose my elder sister Elizabeth and then my father. This left my older brother Warren, myself, and Laura Ann with my mother. I would lose my mother when I was age 7, and my older brother when I was about age 13. This left Laura and Ann and I as orphans, and we were raised at Jackson's Mills by our uncle, Uncle Cummins. After the death of my grandmother, Elizabeth Brake, Laura would go to live with her maternal grandparents at Parkersburg.
General Jackson, you fought for the United States in Mexico. How is it that you can fight against it now?
So I'm proud of my service to the United States when I was in Mexico, and at that time Virginia was a member of that union. With the unconstitutional acts that Mr. Lincoln has performed, he left us no other cause than to withdraw from that union. And as I am first a citizen of Virginia, upon her withdrawal I had no citizenship in the United States, and therefore my allegiance is to Virginia.
General Jackson, I'd like to ask you, do you have any comments on the circumstances of some of the northwestern counties and the northwestern section of Virginia and their movement towards possibly breaking away from Virginia and creating another state?
Sir, I am deeply troubled by this travesty of justice. I feel that the Confederacy in Virginia has let down our loyal citizens in this area. You know that this area of the country and the area of our state is occupied by the Union forces, and they are suppressing the voices of our loyal citizens. A closer look at this area would tell you that only the counties from Parkersburg to the northern panhandle along the Ohio River has any feelings for the northern industrialists, and the Union Army is supporting men like Wiley and Carlisle, which again are Lincoln Republicans and associated with the Northern industrialists, and they're looking after their own interests much more than what they're looking after the common citizen. Their movement up there is centered around those few counties in the area that I've mentioned, and only because the Union Army is present to suppress the true feelings of the people in that area.
Well, I'd like to now welcome, this is not really Stonewall Jackson. This is actually Doug Riley of Tunnelton, West Virginia. And Doug is one of our new History Live presenters, and I want to welcome you to this program.
Thank you, Mark.
And welcome you to our roster as well. And so I'm going to ask you what I ask everyone that's ever been on this show, which is why Jackson? What was it about your character that moved you to want to research him and portray him?
Well, as a history teacher, especially of West Virginia history, this is our most notable character in all of history. He was known world over. And I knew him to be a man of character. He was a man of deep religious faith. And of course, every young man, and as being a former Army officer who studied him in the armor school, he was a brilliant genius at tacticians. And so the interest just grew for me to study him.
How did you organize your research, or how did you conduct your research? I'm assuming you went to particular materials, or did you visit any particular areas?
I've made a couple of visits to VMI where he was a professor. I've met with Dr. Robinson, who's written the probably the best biography on Jackson.
Right.
And we've done a tour of the battlefields where he was at, of course, his home site and things like that. One of the things that I found most difficult in my research was settling for myself how a man of such Christian character and such coming from such values that he came from could have supported slavery. And after studying it, it became to realize that we must judge these people in the time that they lived, not by our standards. Mm-hmm. And when you get down to his relations with the slaves, either there at Jackson's Mills or the ones that was a member of his own household, they were not in the typical sense slaves. Were they on property rolls of his uncles or himself? Yes, but they were really extended members of his family, and he treated them such, and they were part of the family daily devotional services in the house. So
after all the research you had done or have done with him, and I know you're continuing your research on him always, I was just curious, what do you think was Jackson's greatest attribute?
His ability to concentrate. His maxim, you may be whatever you resolve to be, basically says what he was. You got to look at this young man that had almost no formal education, was received an appointment to West Point, entered West Point as the last in his class, yet he graduated 17th in his class. His powers of concentration, his will to overcome is tremendous. His depth of character and his depth of his Christian faith are role models to anybody that would study the man.
Do you remember what year he graduated from West Point?
1846.
So he was part of that really
yes
sort of famous class that included several other.
The other generals, A.P. Hill, George McClellan was the youngest member of that class. Bernard B., that coined the phrase Stonewall Jackson, was a member of that class. John Bulford, they were many of them. John Gibbons, they were his classmates. Pickett was a classmate.
Where was it that Stonewall earned the nickname of Stonewall?
At the First Battle of Manassas, and Stonewall Jackson would always argue that he did not deserve the name, that when B had come back and was trying to rally his troops after having reported to Jackson, General, they are driving us, and General said, then we shall give them a bayonet. B went to the base of the hill to rally his own troops, drew his sword and pointed to the top of the hill, and he said, look there at Jackson's men, standing like a stone wall. Let us resolve to die here this day, and we will be victorious. Jackson always claimed it was a comment about his men and not about himself. Unfortunately, people stuck it to him.
Well, the name stuck with him. But it was known as the Stonewall Brigade.
Yes, it did become that after as well.
You had, he was a Stonewall, came from he didn't have a privileged childhood. Yet he managed to get to West Point. He got an appointment to West Point. He was on the faculty at Virginia Military Institute. What sort of a teacher or instructor was he?
He was a fairly poor teacher. His powers of concentration, he would prepare for his next day's lesson by going home and first reading it, and then sitting in a chair facing the wall and absolutely, through concentration, memorize that lesson. And then he would present it the next day exactly that way. Exactly as the textbooks had it and exactly as he remembered it. And if somebody asked a question, he had to start from the beginning and go through it again. So while he was a great military tactician, his powers of instruction in the classroom didn't vary for people who had different learning styles.
Well, in all of his sort of pre-Civil War experiences, was there ever any inkling or tip-off that he was going to rise to such heights as a tactician and a military commander?
Absolutely. If you take a look at his Mexican War history, he entered that war as a Green Brevet second lieutenant from West Point. And in a short period of time, he was promoted 3 times for bravery under fire. And his tremendous use of his limited artillery that he'd taken to the front showed that when put in battle, this man was going to be a great leader.
Now, of course, his growing up in Western Virginia, in a section that did eventually break off and become West Virginia, his sister or some parts of his family remained in what became West Virginia and Western Virginia?
His sister Laura resided at Beverly, and in fact her son, Thomas Arnold, would reside with the general for a year at VMI so that he could get a better education. Unfortunately, during the war, Laura would depart from her brother and her husband and strongly support the Union troops that was in her area, and the general and Laura stopped communicating during the war.
So that was a rift that was never...
It was a rift that was never taken care of because of the general's untimely death.
And what were the circumstances around Jackson's death?
After the Battle of Fredericksburg and that winter quarters, General Hooker started moving troops to an area called Chancellorsville. Longstreet had been dispatched further south, so it was only Lee and Jackson and that remaining of the army that was there. And therefore Jackson convinced Lee to let him do one of his famous flanking movements. He did so, but there was a lot of confusion of battle and darkness was coming. And as the general usually did, he went out in front of his troops to do his own reconnaissance. And unfortunately, as trying to come back through the ranks, his own men thought he was Union cavalry and they fired upon him. He was not instantly killed, but lost his life after 10 days after an amputation. He got pneumonia.
And what year was that?
That would have been in May of 1863.
1863 was his final time. So, well, I want to thank you, Doug Riley, for being here with us and portraying General Stonewall Jackson for our program of History Live. So, again, this is Mark Payne with the West Virginia Humanities Council. I want to thank you for being with us today and keeping you informed on the Library Television Network. Thank you for watching History Live.